Thank you so much for coming over for this talk. And it's an honor for me to introduce Dr. Scott Stark. And Scott got the Bachelor of Science from University of Pittsburgh and PhD from University of Arizona, and joined MSU here in 2016. And yep. So this is a promotion talk, and all yours.
All right, great. Thank you. Thank you, Aki. And thank you, everybody, for coming, braving the weather, all the other inclement conditions. Okay, for those of you online, that's me doing research, or at least pretending to do research, and a photo shoot. So today I'm going to be talking about the importance of the Amazon forest, climate feedback for Earth's future. And, here's a nice picture of a rainbow over the Amazon forest to start with. And I want to just focus in on a really critical question to understanding this importance. And this is going to be a major topic of the talk today. And that's addressing the resilience of the Amazon to pressures caused by climate change. Okay, so I'm going to start with a roadmap, give you an outline right off the bat. I'm going to be addressing, I see now I'm probably going to have to move this, maybe the bottom corner. Okay, so I'll be addressing this question of how resilient is the Amazon to climate change, and is it nearing a tipping point? I'll start by talking about the climate value of the Amazon forest, giving some background on this and addressing its future. Then I'll talk about some fundamental forest ecology in terms of how resilient the rainforest may be to possible transitions to a savanna-like state. I'm going to talk about rethinking a sort of paradigm that I think is predominant of thinking of the Amazon rainforest as one ecological unit that follows similar rules throughout. We'll be critiquing that, particularly in terms of the role of shallow water table depth forests in the response to climate. And then I'll talk about the tree functional diversity problem. To use a colloquialism, how much resilience is packed into the forest is a key question for addressing climate responses. And I'll give you some examples with a study of green up and brown down observed from satellites, as well as some leaf to ecosystem scaling research that my PhD students are doing. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about sustainability research, interdisciplinary research that I'm participating in, and empowering MSU students with forest atmosphere education. So let's get started. So I want to talk about the exceptional value of intact forest ecosystems, particularly focusing on the Amazon and the services that it provides. So this is, of course, one of the largest intact forest regions in the world, the largest tropical forest, larger than France. It's just briefly, it's hosts something like 10% of the Earth's biodiversity and 1% of the surface. It's home to 30 million people, over 300 recognized indigenous groups, many people both living in urban settings and in non-urban settings, and depending to greater or lesser extent on ecosystem services and natural resources associated with the forest, including a lot of food resources, resources from the river in terms of fish. And there's actually growing international markets for many of products and foods and other items from the forest. The thing that I'm really going to focus on in terms of ecosystem services of the Amazon today, though, is this service in supporting what I like to call healthy climate function, the idea of maintaining cool and wet and predictable climates. And so the first thing that we think about with climate function is the storage of carbon, right? So something like 123 billion tons of carbon are in the Amazon. That's 10% of all biomass on Earth, again, and about 1% of the surface area. That's equivalent to something like 10 years of fossil fuel emissions, which I think is a horrible condemnation on our fossil fuel usage. But in any event, it's critically important. Okay. It's also critically important for the for the evapotranspiration of water, which cools the atmosphere. And so this major function of moving water from the soil into the atmosphere is one of the key things that the Amazon does. And if you'll forgive me for calling this plant sweat, this is from a public outreach seminar. Essentially, that does indicate that this is a cooling function of evapotranspiration. It fundamentally transforms Earth's surface and climate, making it a cooler, wetter, more hospitable place. This is from a documentary that my student Leonardo Ziccardi participated in last year. So I don't need to tell you much about the climate crisis, but I want to focus in on what that means for the Amazon. So in the Amazon, this means an increasing frequency and intensity of droughts. And so actually currently we're experiencing one of the worst droughts in Amazon history with the current El Nino conditions. This brings conditions that are favorable for the spread of fires in the ecosystems that have not historically had a strong prevalence or role of fire. And of course, we also have this context of deforestation, with around 20% of the Amazon deforested and an estimated another 35% in some form of degradation because of direct human activity. So all of this has contributed to a lot of questions about the future of the Amazon, and I bet many of you have seen some articles titled like this one. This was a recent one from the New York Times Magazine, asking if the Amazon has reached its tipping point. So here the idea is they're asking, some scientists say that the Amazon may be at risk of becoming a grassy savanna with profound consequences for the climate. So ultimately, this question of climate tipping point in the Amazon is a problem of coupled forest-atmosphere interactions and feedbacks. So forests are not just affected by the climate, they also impact the climate with their cooling functions that I described. And so if we force the climate and make it hotter, that will have an impact on the forest. It might increase respiration or kill trees or drive more wildfires, which could decrease its cooling potential and ultimately even tip it around from being a major source of carbon uptake. And so this is a key point that I will return to in the talk. But the Amazon is actually taking up carbon that we're emitting into the atmosphere. Globally, there's something called the land sink. And so about 30% of the carbon that's been emitted by fossil fuel consumption has been taken up on land. And the Amazon is a major contributor to that, where carbon dioxide is thought to essentially be fertilizing plant growth. Okay, so this tipping point, the history of this goes back to the sort of shocking revelation of early Earth systems models that were seeking to model the future of climate change as a result of vegetation and other feedbacks in the Earth system. And so this model subjected the Earth to increasing carbon dioxide levels and found that the Amazon died off entirely. And here's a dramatization of the Amazon turning into a grassy system. So this was the result of this paper, and has catalyzed a lot of research. And here we are 20 years later, and there's been recent studies showing that parts of the Amazon have recently switched around from being a sink for carbon dioxide into a source of it, causing us to again address this question of whether or not the Amazon is at a tipping point. Okay, so a fundamental problem here, though, is that we have really wide, or I would say great uncertainty in the actual response of much of the forest in the Amazon to climate pressures. And so why? It's because it's a complicated ecological problem, and we don't have a lot of the right kind of data, the right types of observations, and we lack some of the theory and knowledge to address the predicted responses of forests. And so we need to understand forest states and function and ecological dynamics in a data-driven way. And so this brings us to the overarching questions of the research side of this talk. Can address how resilient the Amazon forest is to climate change, and then look at the question of, are we close to a climate feedback driven tipping point, and what, frankly, what we need to do to really address this problem. So those are our big driving questions. So I'm going to start by briefly talking a little bit about my research looking at forest degradation and addressing this question of possible savannization. And so the background for this part of the talk is that, much of South America is actually savanna, or has historically been savanna. The Amazon forest actually grades into drier and savanna or savanna-like ecosystems. So the picture down on the right is something we call the Cerrado in Brazil. And if you actually look at this figure here from the Staver paper, this whole light green area is a region that's currently in a forested state, but is thought to potentially be savanna if fire were to become prevalent and essentially take hold and structure the ecology around resilience to fire and fire cycles. A problem is that we have this 35% or greater of the Amazon that is somehow impacted by degradation. And here's a figure from work, including our own Dave Skoll, that shows estimated regions impacted by fire and forest edge exposure, fragmentation, logging, et cetera. And so here they estimated it's 38% of the Amazon. This is essentially creating a matrix of forest types, the future of which is uncertain. So I just briefly want to touch on two studies that I've done to look at this problem. So we lack a lot of basic understanding in these forests. And so we did one study focused around this unique central Amazon savanna fragment as an outgroup for comparison. So this is from a news story in the local news about this paper that we had come out. And one of my colleagues talking about it on TV. And also I want to talk about this recent paper that was some of the major postdoc work of my former postdoc, Marielle Smith, who's now faculty at Bangor University in the UK. Okay, so to get into this, I want to talk a little bit about our framework for study. So we're going to be focused on forest structure, above ground forest structure, or canopy structure. So we do a lot of research looking at canopy structure because it provides a unique opportunity to observe ecological drivers and consequences of forest change. This is a little conceptual framework, essentially linking forest structure to the growth and mortality processes of trees, basic forest ecology, and how those processes are impacted by things like disturbance history, climate and edaphic properties, and soil water availability, so forth, with implications for forest function. And so we can assess forest structure using a few different types of remote sensing. I'm going to be focused on LiDAR. So LiDAR gives us an opportunity to estimate the vertical profile of vegetation in the canopy, and then also aspects of structural heterogeneity, like the rugosity, how varied the surface is. In this study, we used a ground transported LiDAR. And so the first thing I want to call your attention to, this is a conceptual framework from the study. We're really focused on the idea that we have a matrix of degraded forest types that range somewhere in between a canopy structure state of a mature forest, which is closed, high leaf area, and wet, and a savanna, which is open, low leaf area, and relatively dry and hot. And so the question is if we can determine anything about whether or not our forests that are in these intermediate states because of degradation are heading towards savanna in a savannization process, or whether or not they're able to recover and are resilient moving back towards mature forest. So our basic questions are just, do we observe patterns consistent with these two different pathways? And so we evaluate this with a large database that Marielle put together during her postdoc, working with over 25 researchers in Brazil, including Ju Schietti and many others. And so we've had over 10 years of data collected with these nice profiling LiDAR systems. And so for this study, we looked at just disturbed sites and used mature forest nearby as control, working in 9 different sites with different types of disturbance, calculating a host of structural metrics. But for brevity, I'm going to focus on leaf area profiles and just summarize what we find in the structural metrics. So we were able to look at selective logging, forest fragmentation, fire, land clearing, and subsequent regeneration. So the first thing I'll show you are our forest structure profiles. So this is where the leaf area occurs on average above the ground in these different forests. Our disturbed forests are the red curves. The control forests are the blue curves. And then we have an important control outgroup, which is savanna, which is here in this black curve that has very low forest structure, very open. So you can note that the red curves all show some sort, or almost all show some sort of difference from the control. So here's a clearing and regrowth. So we can see in this site, there was lower forest in the regrowing forest compared to the control, which isn't a surprise. And we'll be talking a lot about this most impacted site here in a moment. This is a fire in a very special type of Amazon ecosystem called an igapo, where we've seen a lot of forest leaf area loss. So we can just look at the similarity to undisturbed forests across this whole gradient of disturbance types. And like I said, I'm summarizing the results from all the different metrics, but we see an early pattern emerges, which is that we have many forests that look actually quite similar to the control forest, right? And so I should also mention that it's both a strength and a weakness of the study, but in most cases, we're looking at disturbance 5 to 10 years after the disturbance happens. So we're essentially observing a disturbed forest with the potential for some subsequent recovery, right? So in many of these cases, the disturbance that looks like natural forest, it's fair to interpret that as a sign for forest resilience. On the other hand, these forests that are actually way out here and are looking very similar to savanna, we expect are perhaps more likely to be savannized. So we'll zoom in on one of those in a moment. And that's this burned forest, this igapo forest. So igapo forests are seasonally flooded, tend to be low fertility sites. And these are actually known to be incredibly sensitive to degradation. When they burn, it can be entire stand killing fires, as you see in this photograph here. So just very quickly, want to zoom in on a unique thing we were able to do in this study, which was visit a major experimental drought study where an Amazon forest had been subjected to drought for 5 years until the large trees started dying and the leaf areas started falling. And then they ran out of money, the study ended, and the forest was allowed to sit. And so we actually visited this forest 10 years after the cessation of this experimental drought. And so what we didn't have LiDAR profiles from the drought period, but from the data provided in the studies that were done at the time, We know that large trees were impacted. There was increased mortality. We know there was a 30% loss of leaf area. And in 10 years later, we see no signal of impact. So this is, we think, clear evidence, at least in this case, of a resilient response. So to summarize our results, fragmentation, drought, and even selective logging appear to show signs of recovering or being stable. So displaying high leaf area and stratified vertical structure, we think indicates regeneration. On the other hand, fire in a low nutrient soil of an EGOT-PO forest in particular has a strong savannization type impact, creating vegetation that structurally resembles savanna. And clear cuts that we're regenerating are sort of a bit of a question mark, but some of them in particular weren't forming closed canopies. So those might also be showing signs of savannization. So I would just want to conclude this section. You know, of course, a broader study would be needed, but an interesting hint might be provided by considering that we found an impact of fire. We had one site that was an upland forest that was burned that actually looked like it was recovering, didn't show many signs of impact years after the fire. In contrast to this unique low fertility site where we saw a stand level mortality, right? So this might hint at interactions between environmental drivers and fire. And so that's actually kind of the direction I'm going to go in for the segue into the next section of the talk. So this is the idea of rethinking what I'm calling the one Amazon rainforest paradigm. So I guess I might be setting up a bit of a straw man here, but I do think that this is an idea that we see in the literature in different ways, where people really have the tendency to think about the Amazon, which is all pretty low and in large part fairly wet, responding in a pretty similar way across its range, right? So, you know, this is really driven by this type of thinking from the modeling world that truly models it that way. It does not incorporate much environmental heterogeneity, if any, in the function of coupled vegetation and climate modeling for predicting Earth's future. So an example of that is, well, perhaps the example of how one might think in that way is looking at this famous paper talking about the Amazon carbon sink. So the Amazon carbon sink in this is, indicated by a positive number up on that top curve. So this is a study that looks at forest plots that are spread around the Amazon from 1985 to 2010. This is the Rainfor network. It's a huge network of plots. And so they find that these forests are getting more carbon dense on average across this entire window, and with perhaps the highest carbon uptakes early in the time series and a decreasing, i.e. declining carbon sink type dynamics later because of this increase in tree mortality. And so if you're a modeler, that's your takeaway, that's what's happening to the Amazon. My takeaway from this paper rather is this figure where we look at what's happening in all the different plots, okay? So the little arrows are either indicate up or down on these different ecosystem carbon components, the net change, the productivity, the mortality. And what we see, the slopes are model fit relationships for the time series of the data. And what we see is that there's incredible heterogeneity between these plots and whether or not they're increasing, taking up carbon, or losing carbon through this time series. So another example, this is a satellite-based example of the heterogeneity of Amazon forest response to the climate, is this paper titled "Amazon Forest Did Not Green Up During the 2005 Drought." And so here's the image of green up that they found using MODIS remote sensing enhanced vegetation index, which is some metric of photosynthetic capacity, where green means it's getting more photosynthetic, productivity is going up. Brown, or red in this case, means it's going down. And so, you know, if the Amazon did not green up during the 2005 drought, I don't know what's happening in this region, which has clearly a predominant green up signal. So I take away again from this, not the big picture of the title, but rather this incredible heterogeneity in responses. And so putting this all together, you know, we need to think about the ecological factors responsible for this and how they might determine the sensitivity of the entire system. And so, yeah, so the first thing to do is think about environmental variations that might be driving some of this pattern. And I want to start with water. So on the left, we have precipitation gradients. On the right, we have seasonality gradients. There's broad seasonality gradients in the Amazon. There's also edaphic gradients, so soil texture and elevation. And all of those things together create this really, really interesting and we think important environmental variable I'm actually showing modeled through time. So this is the estimate of Amazon water tables, okay? And so what we're looking at, purple means this is a very superficial water table, basically right at the surface. Blue, dark blue and light blue are still very shallow water tables. And if you take the average of this, and that's what we're doing in this figure here, again, blue is shallow, yellow here is medium, red is deep, 20 to 60 meters, shallow is 0 to 5 meters. We see that there's some broad, you know, structure in how deep the water tables are. And interestingly, there's this huge area of the central Amazon that's very shallow in its water table. And so, you know, we know, ecologists know that shallow water table depths have huge impacts on tree function. And so this is just some pictures from one of our shallow water table depth sites with my colleague Giuschietti in the picture. You can see these stilt roots that are a response to this water table that's here less than a meter below the surface. And this creates anoxic conditions. Rooting can't be deep in these forests. And when the water table depths are very high, it can actually lead to effective dormancy in the forest. And so that's a problem from our knowledge based on these plot networks. And so we're showing actually, if you look over here, these gray bars are where the effort in plot sampling is in the Amazon. Light gray, I should say. Dark gray bars are the frequency of the water table depth forests. So the most frequent water table depth condition, again, 1 to 2 meters. We can see most of our understanding is from water table depths that are 20 to 40 meters. So we wrote an NSF proposal to address this problem, and it was funded back in 2019. This is the other side of tropical forest drought. Do shallow water table depth regions in Amazonia act as large-scale hydrological refugia from drought? So what do we mean by that title? Well, our simple-minded hypothesis that we're exploring in this project is the idea that, well, if there's too much water in these shallow water table depth forests, then maybe some amount of drying is actually good for production there, right? So I'll zoom into that idea a little bit more. I just want to say we had leadership from my former postdoc, Marielle, and then the project really would never have gotten started without the leaders, Flavia Costa and Giuschietti in Manaus. They've been working on this problem for over 20 years. And I also want to really thank my PhD student, Natan, who's taken over from after Marielle left, helping lead the program. So I'll show you a few things from this Tansey review. That's our first major product from this project. Where we summarize, you know, synthesize the state of the art in our understanding of the problem. And just to reiterate our hypotheses, the basic idea is if we have this gradient of water table depths, where you see on the left, shallow water tables, and on the right, deeper uplands, deeper water table depths. During regular conditions, the shallow water table depth forests might have a very limited growth window. During moderate drought, that growth window really could be extended because of a greater aerated soil zone for a longer portion of the growing season. But we might also, and in this case, we expect high canopy production, perhaps even boosted compared to normal canopy production in the shallow water table depths. But we might think that severe droughts could have an opposite sort of effect in these shallow water table depth forests if we worry that they're physiologically, that their functional types aren't drought resilient, right? So if we have a severe drought like we're having now, here's some images from the current 2023 El Nino drought in the Amazon. These shallow water table depth forests could be very dry, and they're often associated with sandy soils which drain. So we, to summarize, we think there could be a measure of resilience, and in another turn, there could be a measure of sensitivity. But either way you look at it, the curve of responses relative to upland forests should be very different. Okay, so just really briefly, I'm going to go through this quickly because I don't want to run out of time. Well, we've got this big field study going on. We've built towers. We're monitoring canopy function. We're monitoring forest plot dynamics. We have 3 towers. One, there's a set of 2 that are paired upland and lowland in the Dookie Reserve, and another one on the BR319 I'll show you in a second. And so, yeah, like I said, canopy function monitoring, not eddy covariance at the moment, but we'll be seeking funding for that in the future, fingers crossed. And we're doing a lot of forest canopy structure monitoring. We're also measuring tree functional traits in our plot network, monitoring litter production and the whole carbon cycle as well. And then finally, we're connecting these results to remote sensing, and I will show you the remote sensing side of this in a moment. Here are our towers in the Dookie Reserve. The data are coming in thanks to Eric Esteban and Gabriela Ushida and others working in the field. I'm not going to talk about that. And our third tower is this 75-meter one, 255 feet. That actually, I just got this picture the day before yesterday. It was finished on Sunday. So the tower is up. And this is in a really unique area along the BR319 indicated here on the edge of this massive region of shallow water table depth forest in the central Amazon. So now we just have to go and install the sensors. Okay, so with that, that's my quick summary of the field side that's sort of consumed much of the past 2.5 years of my life. And there it went by in 2 minutes. So let me tell you about a project that's sort of further along because it didn't require the construction of towers in the field. So this is a remote sensing based study. And to do this, I actually want to introduce the idea of tree functional diversity as a major controlling factor on forest sensitivity to climate change, and address how much resilience is packed into the forest. So what, the thing that we're thinking about functional traits that influence drought tolerance, and there's a lot. And so this is just a cartoon that's highlighting deciduousness, where we have a deciduous tree on one side, which might be a drought response strategy. And altogether, we can just think of this in terms of typical plant community assembly theory, where we have some hydrological regime, that is the range and frequency of hydrological conditions through time, has acted on the community evolutionary and community dynamics to sort out a functional trait distribution that then determines our response to climate stress or any climate condition for that matter. So this is our overall sort of simple conceptual framework. We actually do have some math that we're using for comparison with the remote sensing work based on that theory that I'm not going to show you today. The types of traits we're thinking about are resource acquisitiveness, which we think actually trades off with embolism resilience, so a type of drought tolerance, tolerance to anoxia, stomatal control, I already mentioned deciduousness. Key thing is how deep trees root, which has some functional trait component, is also just directly constrained by the environment. And a critical one is hydraulic safety margins. So all of these things may be responding to these water table depth gradients, as well as other environmental gradients in the Amazon, but they are likely to be critical determinants of the responses that we see to climate change related events like these major droughts. So I'll just skip over my sort of framing the the remote sensing work, but I just want to say one of the things that we really try to do in our lab, in my lab, is put together different remote sensing tools in a unique way to try to tell us something about the actual forest ecology of the system while we're comparing to forests that are being monitored in the field. And I'll even tell you a little bit about using a new tool, solar-induced fluorescence. So I want to return to our satellite green up study, this 2005 study that said there was no green up. So we'll go back to our little circle and we can wonder what's underneath that circle when we look at the water table depths. So of course, it's a bit suspicious, and this was one of our motivations in our grant proposal, that there's such a correspondence in the shallow water table depth region. And we thought that could be evidence of this hydrological refugia. By the way, that's where the towers are. So I'm going to tell you about this, a new study done by Shuli Chen, advised by Scott Saleska at, she's a PhD student advised by Scott Saleska at the University of Arizona. They have, we're the lead institution on this grant. They have an associated award. I've been working closely with them on this project since the outset. And these are really exciting results that we have here. This is currently in a major revision for Nature. So up top, what we're looking at are patterns of drought. So this is TRIM data, that's tropical rainfall data for 2005, 2010, and 2015-16, which were three quote unquote 100-year scale droughts in the Amazon. As I mentioned before, we have another one happening this year, not included in the study. And so on the bottom, what we have are some very carefully filtered, statistically significant EVI greenness responses. So this is filtered to only statistically significant pixel responses. So everything that is not significant, you're not seeing. And so what we see is that in 2005, we actually find that there is a strong green up, unlike the title of that paper. 2010, we actually have a brown down, so there's heterogeneity in the responses, but on average, the impact is a loss of canopy function in the drought. In 2015-16, we have a more mixed response, although the average falls just on the brown down side. But if we want to actually address our hypothesis, we have to look at some model results and look at the data when we slice it by where I'm going to show you I'm going to start with only the southern Amazon. So that's the region that I'm highlighting there. It's the largest region in the Amazon. And here we have the EVI anomaly plotted versus hand. And so hand is, I just think of that as another metric for water table depth, okay? So 0 means low water table depth, 30 means approximately 30 meters, okay? And so there's some modeling results in this too. We've actually fit a model to this where we look at the EVI anomaly using a GAM modeling framework, responding to radiation, that's PAR, vapor pressure deficit, that's atmospheric drought, precipitation, maximum cumulative water deficit, so that's how dry the soils get, we think. The length of the drought, hand, again, that's the water table depth, and the pairwise interactions. So the first thing we'll note is we have, distinct responses across the three different droughts. Actually, only in 2005 do we see a green up. So green up is anything above 0 here. But in all cases, we actually see that either the strongest green up or the least brown down occurred in the shallowest water table depth forest. So that actually is strong support for the other side of drought, resilience of shallow water table depth forest hypothesis. So there's interesting structuring of this. I won't go into this in depth because I'm time conscious now, but suffice it to say that there's interesting interactions with radiation. And the reason why 2010 had such a brown down is because it was actually a very low radiation drought, which seems a bit strange, but that's what it looks like. Whereas in 2005, we think that there was essentially good growing conditions in these shallow water table depth forests. We can see this curve at top is the response to PAR radiation in those forests. So basically the drier and sunnier it was, the more those forests produced that year. And I'll skip this drought duration story, but it corroborates, doesn't complicate really. Something that is complicating though is the pattern that we observe when we look in the northern portions of the Amazon and look at the ever wet Amazon, which is the northwest there, and the Guyana Shield, which is north and east up there. And so we don't really see any consistent evidence for an other side of drought type relationship. Instead, we see something that's perhaps the opposite across these drought years in the ever wet Amazon, where shallow water table depth forests showed the least resilience response. And in fact, deeper water table depth forests were somehow enhanced in those years. In the Guyana Shield, we just don't see much response at all. So this is some complicating factors, but we can actually tease out more from this data and make a bit more sense of it if we look at a standardized drought response. So this is the idea of taking our model results and subjecting the entire Amazon to a sort of regularized drought. So just everywhere gets the same sort of intermediate drought conditions, and we can see if it greened up or if it browned down, and use that as a sort of metric of resilience of the forest. So bear with me, this is the idea at least. So I can plot the result of that from our data analysis here, where we show resilience as green and sensitivity as red. So in this sort of standardized drought condition, this is where you would expect places to green up or brown down. You can see we actually don't have a consistent response in this shallow water table depth region, although we do have a lot of green up in there. But we can make some more sense of this if we utilize our knowledge from the literature, factors that we think are likely important in the story, and define some important variables such as where trees are tall. So we just selected sort of the upper quantile of tree heights, infertile soils, so lower quantile of soil fertility, and shallow water table depths, in this case, everything under 5 meters of water table depth, and then all of the possible sort of Venn diagram intersections of these different variables in their geographic coverages around the Amazon. And we get this sort of weird color coding that's hard to wrap your head, around just looking at it. But we can use this to make some bar graphs that are easy to understand and look at this structuring of forest sensitivity or resilience across the Amazon. So that's what we're looking at here. So these are sort of proportions of a particular region defined by these three conditions: tall trees, infertile soils, shallow water table depths, that are either vulnerable, that's the salmon color, neutral, that's yellow, or resilient, that's green. And the gray bars, I should say, are the proportion of the Amazon that these different regions occupy. So we've organized this from more resilient on the right to less resilient on the left, And we get some really interesting patterns in resilience across these three things. So first of all, more resilient, everything that's more resilient is on an infertile soil. So if actually the thing that comes out, I think the most strong result in this analysis is that soil fertility, infertile soils have more drought resilient forests. So after that, we see that the most common environment across the Amazon is this one here. It has the highest gray bar. This is infertile soils with shallow water table depths, and this is the second most resilient forest type, ecotype as we're calling it. So we also see tall trees are really interesting. So if you have tall trees on infertile, deep water table depth soil, that's a highly resilient condition. And we think that's because tall trees actually are able to access deep soil water. And in the infertile case, they have very drought resilient traits. And so on the opposite end, we see that actually tall trees in shallow water table depths are our second most vulnerable forest type. And so we have some hypotheses about that, but it may have to do with how water table depths limit rooting depth. So basically you have shallow roots and high water demand, so such that any sort of significant drought could really reduce water availability for those trees. And if they're in a more or less fertile soils, that makes them more resilient, more sensitive and drought sensitive overall. So, okay, so I know that's a lot, but I think it's some really interesting results. So I do want to move pretty quick to get to some conclusion parts, and I do want to at least give you a little preview of some of the work that my PhD students are doing. Before I do that, I just want to quickly summarize that our basic hypothesis was that we have really distinct behavior of different environmental types, particularly driven by this important variation of water table depths in the Amazon that must be taken into account to understand the future of the carbon sink in the Amazon, or perhaps as climate change gets worse, the carbon source that's represented by a degrading Amazon. And I think that we have, pretty strong evidence in favor of this. The most common type of forest actually was resilient. That's right. The most common type of forest was a resilient one. It was determined by being infertile and having shallow water table depths. And that will really move the curve on what our expectation is for the future carbon sink in the Amazon. And so we found evidence for our core hypotheses. And I just want to add, we also found that it's not just water table depth. There's this really important interaction with soil water, soil fertility, tree height, and I'll skip through my shallow roots part, but all of these things must be taken into account to actually get the future of the carbon story in the Amazon. Okay, so we started 5 minutes late, and so I guess that means I have 10 minutes left. Is that right? Maybe. See if someone pulls me off the stage of the cane. So I'll just very quickly talk a little bit about some of the work that we're doing to push forward our remote sensing approaches to address the carbon balance of the Amazon. So one thing that's really exciting is that we have a theory that lets us link the demography of leaves to the function of the canopy. And we think we can do this from space. So you can actually very accurately predict the productivity of the canopy if you know how many young, mature, and old leaves comprise the canopy at any given time. And this is highly linked to deciduousness of the forest, actually. So we have a functional trait connection here. And so this is a major portion of my PhD student, Natan Gonsalves' thesis, is working on this problem. Just published his first paper. showing that you can predict mature leaves very well with EVI. Something called the green chromatic coordinate predicts young leaves very well. And then this really interesting metric called the anisotropy of EVI, that's basically how much EVI changes as you shift the angle of the satellite, predicts the deciduousness of the forest. And so he showed this at the one site, the Otto site. And actually now we've gone and showed that it works at least for average seasonality across all of the flux sites in the Amazon. This is, don't want to take you through this figure, spend too much time on it. The point is that the red and black lines line up really well. So that's observed versus predicted data based upon these leaf fractions that are shown up top here, and how they change through the unique seasonality of each of these sites and the unique functional traits of those sites. This is a summary of all the flux towers where we apply this method and get a really nice R² on the seasonality prediction. So we don't really know if this works through time yet. So the next question is if this works to get drought responses. But I just want to highlight this has incredible potential to actually move from just looking at like green up, which correlates with productivity, but in a complex way, to actually a prediction of carbon uptake, right? And it gives us a direct insight on deciduousness, which is a critical functional trait that we want to get our hands on for looking at how these things are structured across the Amazon. Get super quickly, Leonard Zaccardi, my other PhD student, is working on fluorescence, and this is related to leaf stress responses, and actually also is a major method from outer space to quote unquote observe photosynthesis. The problem is there's a spate of papers trying to do this in the Amazon. The problem is we don't really think it works very well in the Amazon. So here's a paper showing basically the purple line is from flux and the solid lines are from solar-induced fluorescence measured from space. And they're not capturing the seasonal pattern correctly. So we don't know if this is really a good method for tropical forests, like it is in temperate forests where you can see those nice regular seasonality patterns where everything lines up. So Leo has been climbing trees for the past 5 years with this instrument developed by Dave Kramer in the DOE lab here at MSU, which is a pan fluorometer that's really accurate and lightweight and cheap. And it tells us how much absorbed photons are going to fluorescence at the leaf level versus photosynthesis and versus something called non-photochemical quenching, which is basically heat dissipation. So he's got about 8,000 leaves measured, 200 species, 2 regions, vertically from the ground to 45 meters. And so he's got the first evidence that there's a complex relationship between fluorescence and photosynthesis that's structured by leaf stress. And we see a high stress region starts to show up during the dry season in the forest. So this is really key data for understanding satellite SIF. And he's also found this incredibly interesting vertical structured pattern where it does do things like you'd expect, so more heat dissipation is happening higher in the canopy because there's more heat stress there. But in any event, these things are needed to do an upscaling analysis to really evaluate patterns of drought responses with this important new tool, satellite-based SIF. And he just got a NASA finest 3-year fellowship for $150K to do this. So we're proud of him for getting that. So that's where I will end the science portion of the talk. And I'm basically right at the end, but I'm going to go over for just a few minutes to talk about some sort of programmatic things. I do have some nice summary here that I'll quickly touch on. Want to focus on the one Amazon forest paradigm, say that we think that that's easily falsified. Soil water table depths and fertility appear to be clearly structuring canopy responses, including the future of the Amazon for the climate system. And not just shallow water table depths, but also low fertility and tall tree shallow water table depth areas might really be acting as these refugia as we hypothesized. And so so I'm going to go forward from there. What's next? Don't have time to tell you about my career award proposal that I have under review now. It's really putting all these things together to make a bunch of predictions. I'm not going to talk about all that, but I do want to use this as a jumping off point to talk about education. So one thing that I look forward to doing in the future is to seek funding for graduate students, for graduate education. And so in this proposal, I tried to really come up with a unique and important and substantive component in integrating forest atmosphere RA positions. And the idea is to have students working for 2 to 4 semesters and got a total of 14 semesters of RA funding written into this. The idea would be to have 5 participants, interdisciplinary participants from different places around campus, hopefully working on a portion of their PhD that integrated with some of these broader questions in the Amazon. So that's the idea and the vehicle there. And there's also some undergrad fellowships and an intention to link this with my teaching in forest ecology and graduate forest ecology as well. And, to talk about that some more, I think that fundamental education in forest atmosphere feedbacks is really critical to train our leaders in natural climate change solutions, right? So this is a big objective in forestry. And so I've started doing an incoming survey for students in forest ecology and asking them some questions about their concept of forests and climate change. And so we had, 94% of my survey respondents strongly agreed that healthy forests are critical for fighting climate change. And a bit less, but the majority agreed that forests are threatened by climate change. And, I do think this is increasingly something that's bringing students to our program. I think that the ability of forestry to directly participate in a very meaningful solution for climate change is a key motivating force for our students. It's only increasing in the future. And in order to do the best that we can to enable our students, we really need this forest atmosphere interaction training to be a component of that program. So that's my view on that. So I think, let's see, how am I doing? I'm going to wrap it up, but I just want to say that increasingly I'm trying to work in my academic output on problems of sustainability, and sort of following the charge of CANR to work on natural resources and food systems to meet diverse human needs in a sustainable manner. This is not what we're doing in the Amazon. I take that very seriously. And so boosting bioeconomy is a future objective. And so we've had some progress in this recently, thanks to a new administration in Brazil, taking over from one that seemed bent on only speeding the destruction of the Amazon. And so they're now interested in doing things like boosting acai production in other major bioeconomy areas. And so I've been now putting a lot of my scholarly effort into these sorts of questions with 10 publications in these areas. And I think CANR is really a great place to have this work valued alongside of my natural science contributions and to work interdisciplinary on these problems. And, it's great to have Emilio Moran and Maria Claudia in the audience, because we worked earlier this year on putting together this symposium with CLACS, with Lori Medina at CLACS, on why the Amazon matters for the fate of the Earth. And we really had an interdisciplinary group of people that we brought in and started working on this problem of a sustainable Amazon bioeconomy, and it's led to one NSF proposal so far and more things to come. So with that, I'm going to sort of stop there. I've got some things I'd like to tell you about if I had time, including this new Nature, Ecology, and Evolution paper critiquing the lack of focus on fire in the recent meetings of Lula in Baleine, but I'll let you ask me about it if anyone wants to. with that, I just want to thank everyone in my lab, especially my PhD students, my former postdocs who have moved on to positions, and a lot of other people in Brazil, a lot of institutions, and everybody in the department. You know, I should have like just a giant picture of Katie James here at the end. But yeah, special extra thanks to Katie James here at the end. All right, with that, I'll take any questions, and sorry for running over, I guess.
Talk about solar utility and
Mm.
what does that term embody? Because if you look at it from the point of view of agriculture,
Mhm.
it may not apply to forestry. The big limiting factor for rooting depth is aluminum toxicity.
Yeah.
And so is that implicated at all for taking utilities? Are you talking about aluminum or just general nutrients availability?
Yeah. Okay, so I don't have a great answer to that question, but other than to say that it is a great question. If we could do a layer that sorted out aluminum toxicity, that's a great idea for, you know, taking the work forward. You know, our soil fertility is what we think currently is the best thing, but it's probably not great. And it's actually based on phytometers. So it's like a understory plant-based extrapolation of soil fertility. So it is, one thing that's good about that is that it's based on what the plant sees, at least. So that should be making some sort of integration across problems like toxicity, rather than just like some sort of naive mineral sample. So yeah, but that, you know, I mean, the other things that we looked at are sand content, sand versus clay. Of course, co-varies with a lot of this stuff as you get more shallow water table depths. On average, you get sandier soils, in some cases siltier soils too, some combination of those things, just because of the pluvial lacustrine you know, fluxes that have driven the soils in the central Amazon. So that means, you know, sort of cycles of wetter and drier periods through time in the Amazon are responsible for a lot of that shallow water table depth soil. But anyways, there's a lot of complexities in the soil that we might be able to sort out and actually get a finer view on what these resilience factors are. But I think it's all moot if we can't really link it to what is going on in the functional capacity of the forest and like what the actual environmental conditions that they're being subjected to. So, I mean, that's where I see the work moving, is to do a better job of all of those things. Yeah. Yeah, Moj. Yeah, I think so. So I do have some, through collaboration primarily right now, I am working in forests in the US, not a ton in Michigan, but somewhat, collaborating with Kyla Dallin, especially in geography. And so we're looking at some of the same canopy-based ecology methods, using some of the same remote sensing tools. And I actually, some things that we haven't done in the temperate region that are really new coming out of the tropics, especially the thing that I said my student Natan is working on with the leaf age cohorts. I think we can try that across the regular seasonality here. And you know, there is important differences in leaf functionality that changes as a function of soils and stuff. You know, just today in my forest ecology class, we were talking about, you know, determinate growth versus indeterminate growth. And so there is this like gradient of leaf ages that you get through across seasonality here that differs between different sites. So I want to apply that here. So, I mean, that's just a short answer, but yeah, I think there's great sort of back and forth between Michigan and the Amazon. And I would love to do something like a field course that that goes from temperate to tropics to try to use some of the same sorts of tools.
More questions?
Well, a good model for doing that is the North Carolina State University back in the eighties.
Mm,
They had a program working with rural Indians.
okay.
And their argument, in telling the state, North Carolina, which, Jesse Helms,
Yeah.
at the time, not liking people, spending money outside of North Carolina.
Mm,
Their response was that the soils of the Amazon were very
they're similar.
So
Yeah.
North Carolina, in fact, they were saving money because of the research. It's cheaper to do in the Amazon than it was to do here.
That's a good one.
And they often did in
Oh.
fact, make a case to the legislature that there's, when you have similar fertility issues in soil
Mm-hmm.
or hydrological conditions,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it makes sense to learn from another system which is similar.
Yep.
And apply to the other one. And they had that program going for 15 years.
That's nice. I really, I mean, I don't see much distinction between thinking about temperate forest ecology and tropical forest ecology. Like, of course, there's some differences, but like, yeah, the vast majority of things have some translatability.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all. Thanks, everyone.